Europe in the 1930s was a continent still bruised from the First World War, and in that bruise festered anger, humiliation, and hunger. Out of that rot rose a man who promised to make Germany proud again, Adolf Hitler, a failed artist who turned words into weapons and despair into devotion. To millions of Germans crushed by the Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression, he appeared almost messianic. He spoke of destiny, of blood and soil, of empire reborn. His voice crackled through radios, echoed across torchlit parades, and stirred a people desperate for order. When the world watched him rearm Germany in defiance of every international law, many dismissed him as a gambler bluffing with empty pockets. But the gamble was working. In 1936, his troops marched into the Rhineland without resistance. In 1938, he annexed Austria under the pretext of uniting all Germans. By 1939, he had swallowed Czechoslovakia piece by piece, while the democracies muttered protests. The illusion of invincibility had begun to take root, not only among his enemies, who hesitated to challenge him, but in Hitler himself, whose faith in his own genius would become his greatest weakness. The lightning war that followed in 1939 was a storm Europe had never seen. Poland was crushed in weeks. France, thought impregnable behind the Maginot Line, fell in a month. Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, each toppled like dominoes. The Nazi war machine seemed to rewrite the rules of battle. Panzer divisions sliced through defenses, while dive bombers screamed overhead, sowing terror. Behind the lines, the SS hunted down opponents, and conquered populations were told they had witnessed the birth of a new order. London burned under the Blitz, the swastika flew from the Atlantic to the Balkans, and Hitler's generals, though uneasy about his erratic decisions, could not deny the results. Yet within that triumph lay the seed of his downfall. Victory had come too easily. He began to believe in his own myth, imagining himself a strategist beyond history's reach. The cautious, pragmatic leadership that had characterized the early Nazi expansion gave way to megalomania. He stopped listening to his generals, trusting instead his instincts, which were increasingly warped by ideology and delusion. While Germany appeared unstoppable, cracks began to form behind the facade. The economy, geared entirely for short bursts of conquest, struggled to sustain a prolonged war. Hitler had promised his people bread and victory. He gave them ration cards and death notices. Still, the propaganda machine kept morale high, feeding the nation stories of destiny fulfilled. In 1941, he turned eastward to the one campaign he believed would seal his place beside Caesar and Napoleon: the invasion of the Soviet Union. He called it Operation Barbarossa, and he was certain it would end within months. The Wehrmacht advanced like a steel tide, capturing millions of Red Army soldiers and reaching the outskirts of Moscow by winter. Yet that winter, one of the coldest in decades, froze not only machinery, but ambition. German troops lacked proper clothing, supplies dwindled, and Hitler refused to allow retreats. He had underestimated both the vastness of Russia and the will of its people to resist. What was supposed to be a swift conquest became a war of attrition, a nightmare of mud, snow, and endless corpses. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility cracked. Even then, Hitler could have sought a negotiated peace, consolidating his empire in the West, but compromise was not in his vocabulary. When Japan bombed Pearl Harbor in December 1941, he declared war on the United States, another fatal blunder. Now he faced the industrial might of two giants, the United States and the Soviet Union. While his enemies coordinated production and strategy, Hitler micromanaged every decision, sacking capable commanders and replacing them with sycophants. He shifted divisions back and forth across the continent to satisfy his whims. By 1942, German momentum had slowed, and whispers spread even within his circle that the Führer had lost touch with reality. Yet propaganda kept the illusion alive. The people saw maps covered in red arrows of conquest and believed the end was near. But beneath those maps lay mass graves, broken supply lines, and a leader who no longer trusted anyone, not even himself. The tide would not turn in a single moment, but through a series of decisions born of arrogance. Hitler's obsession with racial purity diverted resources from the front to death camps, where millions were murdered instead of contributing to the war effort. His refusal to adapt strategy in the face of new realities left the German army overextended and vulnerable. And above all, his inability to admit mistakes condemned his nation to catastrophe. As 1942 faded into 1943, the world began to sense a shift. The Wehrmacht, once a symbol of unstoppable power, found itself bleeding out in the snow-choked ruins of Stalingrad. There, in a city that bore the name of his greatest enemy, Hitler's dream of empire began to die. The ruins of Stalingrad were not merely the grave of 2 million men. They were the grave of an empire's delusion. When the last remnants of the German Sixth Army surrendered in February 1943, the spell of invincibility shattered across Europe. For the first time, the world saw the Nazi war machine bleed and falter. Hitler had insisted that Stalingrad be taken at all costs, refusing every plea from his generals to withdraw. Not one step back, he raved, turning a battle into a symbol of pride rather than strategy. What began as a push to capture an industrial city on the Volga became an inferno of rubble, starvation, and frostbite. German soldiers, surrounded and cut off, froze in their foxholes while Soviet forces closed the trap. Hitler's voice, once so certain, trembled with rage as he ordered phantom divisions to relieve Paulus's army, divisions that existed only on paper. When General Friedrich Paulus finally surrendered, defying the Führer's demand to die fighting, Hitler called him a coward. But the truth was clearer than ever. It was Hitler who had doomed them. The shock of Stalingrad reverberated through occupied Europe. For the first time, whispers of rebellion grew louder. The Nazi leadership tried to hide the disaster, but the funerals and telegrams told their own story. Goebbels launched a campaign for total war, urging civilians to sacrifice everything. But enthusiasm had dimmed. Factories strained under bombings, railways were choked with refugees, and in cities from Hamburg to Munich, people began to question whether their 1,000-year Reich would even last a decade. The Allies, sensing opportunity, intensified their efforts. British and American bombers turned German industrial centers into smoldering wastelands. Meanwhile, the Red Army, re-energized and better equipped, began pushing westward with a ferocity born of vengeance. The Nazi Empire was now defending on all fronts, its resources stretched thin, its leadership paralyzed by Hitler's micromanagement. As the war dragged into 1943, Hitler's distrust of his generals deepened into paranoia. He believed betrayal lurked in every command tent. Field Marshal Manstein, one of his most brilliant strategists, urged a tactical withdrawal to preserve strength, but Hitler forbade it. "I will not retreat," he shouted. "I will not repeat 1918. That old wound, the humiliation of Germany's World War I surrender, haunted him. Every setback he saw as treason, every retreat as dishonor. He replaced pragmatism with ideology, strategy with stubbornness. In his mountain fortress at Berghof, he surrounded himself with flatterers and sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear. His world became one of maps and fantasies. Red arrows on paper moved with the stroke of his hand, oblivious to the blood they represented on the ground. The year 1943 was also when Hitler's diplomatic web began to unravel. Italy, once a proud Axis partner, was collapsing under Allied invasion. Mussolini's regime, rotted by corruption and defeat, fell in July, and the Italians switched sides. Hitler's fury was volcanic. He ordered German troops to occupy northern Italy and rescue his old ally, installing him as a puppet in the so-called Italian Social Republic. Yet the effort drained precious divisions from the Eastern Front. In the Balkans, partisans led by Tito harassed German supply lines. In France, the resistance grew bolder. Even within Germany, plots against Hitler began to simmer. Officers who had once sworn absolute loyalty now whispered of assassination. They saw that his madness was not only destroying the army, but the nation itself. Still, the Führer refused to yield. In July 1943, he launched Operation Citadel, a massive offensive at Kursk meant to regain initiative on the Eastern Front. It was the largest tank battle in history, and another catastrophe. Soviet defenses were deep and well prepared, guided by superior intelligence. The Germans vaunted Tiger tanks bogged down in minefields and mud, while Soviet counterattacks encircled them yet again. When Hitler finally called off the offensive, his army had lost irreplaceable armor and men. After Kursk, the Germans would never again take the strategic offensive in the east. The rest of the war would be a retreat. By 1944, the Reich was in slow-motion collapse, though Hitler refused to see it. His speeches grew feverish, his appearance gaunt, his hand trembling. Yet he still commanded absolute obedience through fear and fanaticism. He blamed his failures on cowards and saboteurs, purging anyone who dared question him. The Gestapo silenced dissent at home, but not even terror could conceal the truth. The skies above Germany were now filled daily with Allied bombers. Hamburg burned in a firestorm that killed tens of thousands. Civilians dug through the ashes of their homes, whispering the unthinkable. Perhaps the Führer was not a savior after all. Meanwhile, in the West, the Allies prepared for a return to Europe. The D-Day landings in June 1944 were the final nail in the coffin of Hitler's dream. Despite massive fortifications along the Atlantic Wall, the Germans were taken by surprise. Hitler, convinced the invasion was a feint, refused to release his armored divisions until it was too late. By the time he reacted, the Allies had established a beachhead and begun pouring men and machines into France. Within weeks, Paris was liberated. The Reich was now trapped between two advancing armies, the Soviets from the east, the Western Allies from the west. Yet even in the face of annihilation, Hitler's delusions only deepened. He believed new miracle weapons, the V-2 rockets, jet fighters, would turn the tide. But technology could not compensate for exhaustion, shortages, and lost faith. Still, his closest followers clung to hope, not out of belief, but out of fear. To doubt Hitler was treason, punishable by death. The assassination attempt of July 20, 1944, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, nearly succeeded. The explosion in the Wolf-Lier bunker shook the room and left Hitler injured, but alive. His survival only fed his delusions of destiny. He claimed Providence itself protected him. In retaliation, he unleashed brutal purges. Thousands were executed, including some of his most loyal officers. But beneath the surface, even his inner circle began to understand that the end was near. The question was no longer whether Germany would lose, but how much of it would survive the fall. By the winter of 1944, Hitler's Reich had become a fortress of smoke and illusions. The once proud armies that had thundered across Europe were now shadows of their former selves, retreating through ruins and ash. The Eastern Front, once deep in Soviet territory, was collapsing under the Red Army's relentless advance. In the West, Allied forces pressed through France and Belgium, their bombers reducing German cities to dust. Every night, the skies glowed red over the Rhine as factories, railways, and entire neighborhoods burned. In Berlin, the people huddled in basements, listening to air raid sirens, wondering when the next one would be the last. Yet, even as the walls closed in, Hitler clung to the illusion that victory was still possible. "If we only hold out," he told his ministers, "the Allies will fracture, they will turn against each other, and Germany will rise again." But his words, once thunderbolts of command, now echoed in an empty chamber of madness. The German army was bleeding on all fronts. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets launched massive offensives that pushed the Wehrmacht back hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. The once mighty Panzer divisions were reduced to understrength skeletons manned by teenagers and old men. Cities like Warsaw, Königsberg, and Budapest became battlegrounds, their inhabitants caught between retreating Germans and advancing Soviets. In the West, after the Allies broke through Normandy, Hitler attempted one last desperate gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, known later as the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, he threw his remaining armored forces into the snowy forests of Belgium, hoping to split the Allied lines and recapture Antwerp. For a few days, the gamble worked. The surprise attack caught the Allies off guard, and German tanks pushed deep into enemy territory. But fuel shortages, fierce resistance, and unbreakable Allied air power doomed the offensive. When the weather cleared and the skies filled with Allied planes, the German columns were torn apart. Thousands of soldiers were killed or captured, and Hitler's final strategic reserve vanished in the snow. The war, by then, was lost beyond any redemption. Inside the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, the world had shrunk to concrete walls and maps covered with red pins. Hitler's health had deteriorated sharply. His hands trembled uncontrollably, his posture stooped, his face gray with exhaustion. Gone was the fiery orator who once mesmerized crowds of thousands. In his place was a broken man, pacing and muttering to himself. Yet his authority remained absolute. He refused to flee, declaring that he would stand or fall in Berlin. His generals, many of whom knew the situation was hopeless, dared not contradict him. When they brought him reports of collapsing fronts, he accused them of treason. "There are no loyal men left," he ranted, "only traitors and weaklings." He fantasized about imaginary divisions that could turn the tide and moved them around on maps as though willing them into existence. His staff knew it was madness, but to say so was to die. Outside, the German people were enduring their own apocalypse. Entire cities lay in ruins. Millions were homeless, wandering across a devastated landscape. Food was scarce, fuel non-existent, and winter cold gnawed at their bones. Refugees fled westward from the advancing Soviets, their carts filled with the remnants of shattered lives. Stories of atrocities, mass rapes, executions, villages burned, spread terror through the countryside. The war Hitler had unleashed in the name of conquest now came home with a vengeance. In every direction, the world he had built was burning. And yet, propaganda continued to pour from the radio. Goebbels urged the population to fight to the last, promising that Germany's secret weapons would soon bring victory. But no one believed it anymore. Faith had turned to fear, and fear to despair. In early 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine. The Soviets advanced through Poland and into eastern Germany. Town after town fell, their defenders either dead or surrendered. The myth of the master race dissolved in the smoke of defeat. Hitler issued Nero decrees, ordering the destruction of Germany's own infrastructure, bridges, factories, railways, so that nothing useful would remain for the victors. His own ministers hesitated to carry out these suicidal commands, realizing he no longer cared about saving Germany, but only about punishing it for failing him. Albert Speer, his armaments minister, secretly defied the order, preserving what little remained of the nation's industry. Meanwhile, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, began secret negotiations with the Allies, seeking a separate peace, another act of betrayal in Hitler's eyes.
By April 1945, the Red Army surrounded Berlin. The final act was underway. Soviet artillery rained down upon the city, reducing it to rubble. German soldiers, old men of the Volkssturm and boys of the Hitler Youth, fought with desperate courage, but it was a hopeless struggle. The Soviets advanced street by street, building by building. Inside the bunker, Hitler raged at imaginary traitors, issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed. His inner circle, Goebbels, Eva Braun, Bormann, and a few others, remained with him, trapped in the underground tomb of the Reich. The air stank of sweat, smoke, and despair. Above them, Berlin was dying. Civilians huddled in basements as shells exploded overhead. Flames climbed into the night sky, painting it red, a fitting color for the empire's last sunset. On April 29th, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief, surreal ceremony. They toasted with cheap champagne and signed their wills. The next day, as Soviet troops closed in on the Reich Chancellery, Hitler said his final goodbyes. In the afternoon, a single gunshot echoed through the bunker. The man who had brought Europe to ruin was dead by his own hand. His body was burned in the garden above, as per his orders. Around him, the world he had built crumbled into dust. The 1,000-year Reich had barely lasted 12. Outside, Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag, marking the symbolic end of Nazi Germany. But Hitler's death did not bring immediate peace. The war still raged in fragments across Czechoslovakia, Austria, northern Italy, where German forces continued fighting even after the Führer's suicide. It took another week before Germany's unconditional surrender was signed on May 8, 1945. The guns fell silent, but the silence was heavy. Europe was in ruins. Tens of millions were dead. Entire cities were gone. Hitler promised glory and delivered annihilation. The empire he sought to build would be remembered not for triumph, but for terror, for the ashes of Stalingrad, the ruins of Berlin, and the smoke rising from the concentration camps.
The guns had fallen silent, but the echo of Hitler's war lingered across the world like a scream that refused to fade. Germany lay in ruins, its cities turned to rubble, its people broken, its soul in mourning. When the surrender was signed on May 8, 1945, there were no cheers, only exhaustion. Across Berlin, survivors crawled out from basements and cellars, blinking at the gray daylight that revealed a landscape of total destruction. Streets were filled with debris, twisted metal, and the smell of death. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years of dominance had been reduced to dust in just 12. Hitler's corpse, burned and buried in secrecy, had left behind a void, both physical and moral. For the German people, the nightmare was over, but the reckoning had only begun. The Allied forces divided Germany into occupation zones, the Americans in the south, the British in the northwest, the French in the west, and the Soviets in the east. Each zone became a laboratory for rebuilding a broken nation, but also for shaping the post-war world. The Western Allies emphasized democracy and reconstruction. The Soviets imposed control and retribution. The city of Berlin itself, once Hitler's proud capital, was sliced into 4 parts, a symbol of Germany's fractured fate. Amidst the ruins, millions of refugees wandered homeless, displaced by borders redrawn and cities erased. Entire families searched for missing loved ones, their lives shattered by the chaos of war. Famine loomed, disease spread through overcrowded camps.
The people who had once shouted Sieg Heil now whispered prayers for bread and peace. In the days after Hitler's death, news of the concentration camps stunned the world. As Allied forces advanced, they liberated places whose names would become synonymous with horror: Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen. The liberators found piles of corpses, skeletal survivors, and evidence of a machinery of death beyond comprehension. The scale of the Holocaust, 6 million Jews murdered, alongside millions of Roma, Poles, Slavs, and political prisoners, was revealed in photographs and testimonies that shocked even hardened soldiers. The myth of German glory disintegrated completely. The world saw not the proud master race, but a nation complicit, whether through belief, obedience, or silence, in the greatest crime in human history. Hitler's defeat was no longer just a military collapse, it was a moral one. His dream of racial purity had led only to ruin and infamy. For the Allies, victory brought both relief and responsibility. Europe had to be rebuilt, not just physically, but spiritually. The United States launched the Marshall Plan to revive Western economies, while the Soviet Union tightened its grip on the East, transforming its zone into the communist German Democratic Republic. The Iron Curtain had descended, dividing not just Germany, but the world. Out of Hitler's ashes rose the Cold War, a new global struggle between two ideologies, capitalism and communism, each claiming to defend freedom from the tyranny the Nazis had embodied. The Berlin Wall, erected years later, would stand as a grim monument to that division. Hitler's war had destroyed one dictatorship only to give birth to a new kind of standoff, not of armies clashing across Europe, but of nuclear weapons poised across oceans. Inside Germany, the process of denazification began. The Allied powers sought to purge every trace of Nazi ideology from society. Party officials, teachers, police officers, and soldiers were interrogated and often imprisoned. Many claimed ignorance, insisting they had merely followed orders. But the Nuremberg trials, held in 1945 to 1946, made clear that obedience was no defense against atrocity. 24 of Hitler's top lieutenants stood before an international tribunal charged with crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming: documents signed in their own hands, testimonies from survivors, and films showing the horrors of the camps. The trials marked the first time in history that leaders were held personally accountable for war crimes. Some were hanged, others sentenced to life in prison. Justice was imperfect, but it was a beginning, a line drawn between civilization and barbarism. Yet, even as the world tried to heal, the question lingered: how had one man led an entire nation into madness? Historians, philosophers, and survivors all sought answers. Some pointed to the economic despair of the 1920s and 30s, others to the intoxicating power of propaganda, or the failure of other nations to act before it was too late. But perhaps the most chilling lesson was that ordinary people, when seduced by fear and pride, could commit extraordinary evil. Hitler's loss was inevitable not because his enemies were stronger, but because his vision was unsustainable, built on hate, lies, and hubris. He united his people through fear and conquered through brutality, but he could not build a future on ashes. His empire was doomed from the moment it demanded obedience instead of conscience, conquest instead of compassion. The physical remnants of the Reich disappeared quickly. The swastikas were torn down, the monuments destroyed. But the psychological scars would last for generations. In schools and churches, Germans began to confront the truth of what had been done in their name. Some could not bear it. Others vowed never to repeat it. Nie wieder, never again, became a national oath. Out of guilt and reflection grew a new Germany, one that sought peace, democracy, and reconciliation. The same land that once produced Hitler would later give rise to leaders who championed unity and human rights. It was a long road, but it began in the rubble of 1945 when the world finally understood the true cost of blind obedience. Across the globe, the consequences of Hitler's war reshaped nations and destinies. The United Nations was founded in 1945 to prevent future conflicts of such scale. Colonial empires weakened by war began to crumble, giving birth to new nations seeking independence. Technology, accelerated by wartime innovation, ushered in the atomic age. The Holocaust led to renewed efforts to protect human rights, culminating in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the eventual establishment of Israel. Ironically, the very war Hitler began to impose his ideology instead united the world against it. His defeat became a catalyst for progress, a grim testament to how destruction can sometimes force renewal.
But the lessons of Hitler's downfall were fragile, often forgotten in the decades that followed. Humanity rebuilt, but ambition and arrogance remained part of its nature. The ruins of Berlin became a warning carved into history, that power built on hate will always consume itself, that tyranny cannot outlast truth, and that no empire, no matter how mighty its armies or terrifying its symbols, can survive when it wages war against the very essence of humanity. Hitler lost not merely to the Allies' strength, but to his own blindness. His empire was a monument to destruction, and in its fall, the world rediscovered the value of freedom. When the smoke cleared and the guns went silent, the world stood staring into a mirror darkened by its own reflection. The Second World War had not only destroyed cities and armies, it had shattered illusions about civilization itself. In the ashes of Hitler's defeat, humanity was forced to confront the depth of its own cruelty and the price of ignorance, obedience, and hate. The story of why Hitler lost was no longer just a chronicle of battles and strategy. It became a moral reckoning, a testament to the limits of power built on terror. His loss was inevitable because it was woven into the very fabric of his ambition. The Reich he built depended on endless conquest to survive. The moment it stopped expanding, it began to collapse. Hitler did not lose because the Allies were perfect, but because his empire, born of lies and violence, could not sustain itself against truth and humanity's collective will to resist. In the years following the war, Germany became a symbol of both ruin and rebirth. Under Allied occupation, it was rebuilt from the ground up, not only in concrete and steel, but in conscience. The process was painful and slow. Millions of displaced people wandered across Europe, borders were redrawn, and cities like Dresden and Cologne rose again from the rubble. The scars of war were everywhere, in the shattered families, the empty chairs at dinner tables, the bombed-out churches. Yet within that devastation, a quiet resolve took hold. Ordinary Germans, many of whom had once cheered Hitler, began to face the enormity of what had been done in their name. Trials continued beyond Nuremberg, uncovering crimes in small towns, in police stations, in the silent cooperation of neighbors. The myth of "we didn't know" dissolved under the weight of evidence. For a generation raised on lies, truth became both punishment and salvation. Meanwhile, the victors themselves were forced to grapple with what victory meant. The United States emerged as a superpower, wielding the atomic bomb that had ended the war in Japan, but ushered in a new age of fear.
The Soviet Union, triumphant but scarred by 20 million dead, expanded its reach across Eastern Europe, spreading its own brand of authoritarian rule. Britain and France, though victorious, were weakened, their empires crumbling. From Africa to Asia, colonies began to rise up, inspired by the rhetoric of freedom that had defeated fascism. The world Hitler sought to dominate had been permanently transformed, but not into the order he imagined. Instead, his defeat marked the beginning of a new struggle between democracy and dictatorship, freedom and control, West and East. The Cold War, in many ways, was the ghost of Hitler's war, haunting a divided planet. Yet amid the political shifts, the human cost remained the true legacy. Across Europe, survivors tried to rebuild their lives. In the DP camps, Jewish survivors of the Holocaust searched for relatives who would never return. Some went to Palestine, others to America, carrying memories that words could not express. The creation of Israel in 1948 was born partly from the world's guilt over what had happened under Hitler's regime. In classrooms and courtrooms, in books and memorials, humanity began the long process of remembering. To forget, they said, would be to risk repetition. Out of that vow grew a new international consciousness, one that sought to define human rights, to prevent genocide, to hold nations accountable. The dream was imperfect and often betrayed, but it was real. The Holocaust became not just a chapter of German history, but a warning to all humanity. Hitler's downfall also reshaped warfare itself. The concept of total war, where entire populations become targets, left deep scars on the global psyche. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki demonstrated that humanity had gained the power to annihilate itself. The world vowed once again that such destruction must never happen again. And yet the nuclear arms race began almost immediately, as if mankind could not escape its own shadow. In that sense, Hitler's legacy was paradoxical. His defeat taught the world the need for peace, but his war accelerated the creation of weapons that made future wars even deadlier. It was a grim reminder that knowledge, like power, is neutral. It becomes good or evil, depending on the hands that wield it.
Decades passed, and the ruins turned into memorials. Children grew up where their parents had fought and died. The images of Hitler, once displayed in every school and square, were now confined to museums and history books, symbols of what must never return. Germany, now democratic and peaceful, became one of the world's most stable nations, a testament to the possibility of redemption through self-reflection. But even as the world moved on, the shadow of that war remained. Every generation since has asked the same questions. How could it have happened? Why did so many follow one man into madness? And could it happen again? The answers are never simple. They lie in fear, pride, ignorance, and the seductive power of belonging. Hitler understood how to manipulate these emotions, and in the end, they consumed him as surely as they consumed the nation he ruled. Ultimately, Hitler lost because his vision was a lie from the beginning. He believed that violence could purify, that domination could bring peace, that hatred could build an empire. History proved him wrong on every count. The empire he dreamed of, a world under one race, one leader, one ideology, collapsed under the weight of its contradictions. In trying to destroy others, he destroyed himself. His armies, once symbols of precision and power, became instruments of chaos. His people, once proud, became prisoners of fear. His name, once revered by millions, became a curse. In death, he achieved the opposite of what he sought, not glory, but eternal infamy. His story endures not because he succeeded, but because he failed so completely that the world was forced to change in response. And so the final lesson of Hitler's defeat is not merely about strategy or politics. It is about humanity. It is a warning that evil rarely announces itself with horns and fire. It often comes dressed in promises of greatness, in the language of unity and renewal. It thrives when people surrender their conscience for comfort, their freedom for security. The fall of the Third Reich was not only the end of a war, it was the reaffirmation of a truth older than any empire, that no ruler, no ideology, no nation can stand forever against the basic dignity of human life. Hitler's Germany rose on the wings of hatred and fell beneath the weight of its own inhumanity. The ruins of Berlin, the silence of Auschwitz, the ghosts of Stalingrad, all stand as eternal witnesses. In the end, the story of why Hitler lost is also the story of why humanity endured. Out of the darkest night came a dawn, scarred, imperfect, but alive. Nations rebuilt. Enemies became allies. The world learned, however briefly, that unity born of compassion is stronger than unity born of fear. The swastika fell, but the hope of peace survived. That, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all. Not of armies, but of memory. Hitler sought to shape the future in his image. Instead, the future remembers him only as a warning, carved into the conscience of humankind, that tyranny always consumes itself, and that no empire of hate can stand against the enduring power of truth.